Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to present the top 5 forehands in the history of tennis. And I've already made videos on the top 5 serves of all time, the top 5 one-handed, two-handed backhands, and the top 5 forehands. But these were videos made in a short format where I actually tried to imitate these strokes. And while this videos had a pretty good comedic effect because I really can't imitate those strokes, the long form versions of these videos are long overdue, so you can expect me to do a series on the top 5 serves, the top 5 backhands, and so on. But in today's video, we're going to discuss the greatest forehands in the history of tennis. Now, these videos are going to be very important because what coaches perceive to be the best strokes is often what gets taught at the junior level and at the recreational level. So you have to stay tuned until the end of today's video, where I'm going to tell you how the top 5 rankings apply to the recreational level. In other words, what you should adapt from the best forehands in the world and what you should stay away from. Also, a disclaimer that in this video series, I'm going to be talking about male strokes. And this is no disrespect to female strokes. I'm a big supporter of female tennis, but it is clear that male strokes are better, and therefore I'm going to be using male players when I make my stroke rankings. This is no disrespect to some of the great female players. When we're talking about the forehands, the greatest female forehands in the history of tennis are Steffi Graf, Serena Williams, Monica Seles. My favorites are Sloane Stephens, Madison Keys, and even right now we have some great forehands, Rybakina, Sabalenka, and of course, Iga's forehand could be one of the best of all time. But having said all that, male forehands are obviously better, and I'm going to present my top 5. But before I do so, I spent a lot of time preparing for this video. I have a list of forehands that are not featured in my top 5. I'm going to read these names because these forehands deserve a lot of respect. And this list features a lot of players. And you're going to be wondering, Nick, why are you reading out so many names? Because the forehand is one of the most important shots on the ATP Tour. When we're talking about modern tennis, the players that you see on TV right now, you're not going to find a player with a poor forehand. I'm sure you guys are thinking about Benoit Paire. I would take Benoit Paire's forehand any day. While it looks quirky in the back, when you look at the front of the stroke, he has a lot of topspin, and it's a fundamentally correct forehand. So you could say that having a strong forehand, more specifically a strong topspin forehand, is a prerequisite to be among the best players in the world. There are some forehands in the history of tennis that stand out, and let me read the list of names that didn't make it into my top 5. Lendl, Soderling, Sampras, Del Potro, Blake, Moya, Muster, Ferrer, Roddick, Sock, Borg, Murray, Agassi, Tsonga, Bruguera, Safin, Monfils, Ferrero, Verdasco, Berdych, Courier, Thiem, Wawrinka, Kyrgios, Dimitrov, Becker, and Hewitt. And by Becker, I'm talking about Boris Becker, no disrespect to Benjamin Becker. And to me, Boris Becker hit the forehand the same way the players hit it today that you're watching on TV. So while he's not the father of the modern forehand, that's Bjorn Borg. You can watch a video that I made 4 years ago about the father of the modern forehand. Bjorn Borg, despite his coaches telling him not to do so, went over on his grip to the western side. He developed a loop on his forehand. He would go Rafa style around his head. He was the first to do this. And many coaches were telling him, if you hit your forehand like this, you're not going to get anywhere. But Borg didn't listen. He's truly the father of the modern forehand. However, when we get into the power topspin forehands with the utilization of the entire body, in my opinion, Boris Becker was the first one to have the modern power forehand with a tremendous amount of body involvement. And now let's get to the top 5. So at number 5, I was debating whether I should put Del Potro or Fernando Gonzalez at the 5th spot. And I could have put either guy there because both of these forehands are, in my opinion, in the top 5. But I chose Fernando Gonzalez, and if you're unfamiliar with Fernando Gonzalez, he was a player from Chile who didn't win a Grand Slam. He's not one of the greatest players of all time by any means, but he had one of the greatest forehands in the history of tennis. And you have to understand that when I make these lists, I'm using the strokes in isolation. So when it comes to the serve, for example, there's going to be players in my top 5 that are not necessarily the greatest players of all time. So I'm using the strokes in isolation and leaving out the entire context of a player. But Fernando Gonzalez had one of the most powerful topspin forehands in the history of tennis. When we take a look at his technique, he had a high loop, meaning that the racket would go pretty high in the back. So there was a lot of momentum being built from his high loop, and then he would come into the contact with a bent arm. He had a tremendous amount of body involvement, which means that he would throw his entire body weight into the forehand. If you go on YouTube, just type in Fernando Gonzalez forehand, you're gonna see compilation videos of Fernando hitting one forehand winner after the next, and it's truly spectacular to watch. At number 4, and this might be controversial, I'm gonna put Carlos Alcaraz, and some of you guys might think, Nick, he hasn't proven himself yet. Why are you putting him at number 4? Well, in my opinion, he has already proven himself. He won 2 Grand Slams, he's won Master Series tournaments. So it's okay for me to put him at number 4 of all time, because I'll be honest with you guys, I've never seen a forehand quite like Alcaraz's forehand. To me, it seems to be the ultimate combination of control and power. So he has a tremendous amount of top spin on his forehand, but he can also hit it incredibly hard. You could make an argument that it's a mixture between a Federer forehand and a Nadal forehand. And interestingly, when Alcaraz was younger, he was asked who his favorite player was, and he didn't say Rafa, he actually said Federer. So if I compare Alcaraz's forehand to Nadal, it is not as high, it's more penetrating. And when I compare Alcaraz's forehand to Federer's, it's not as low, so it's a little bit higher than Federer's. It possibly has a little bit more shape to it. So to me, it's the best of both worlds, and if I make this video in 10 years from now, Alcaraz could easily have the greatest forehands in the history of tennis. That's how highly I value his forehand. So you're probably thinking, Nick, if you put Alcaraz in your top 5 of all time and he's one of the next gen players, why didn't you mention any of the other next gen in your list of best forehands who didn't make the top 5? Well, I'm going to tell you that while Alcaraz has proven himself, the other players haven't quite proven themselves, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a good forehand. Obviously, you take the entire next gen, they all have incredible forehands. We need to give them some time to develop their careers and start making some bigger results for them to be named as having one of the greatest forehands in the history of tennis. And when we take a closer look at Alcaraz's forehand technique, we'll see that he has a straight arm on his forehand, very similar to Federer and Nadal. Another interesting thing about Alcaraz is that he has a very low base on a lot of his forehands. Not all of them, but often he will stay low to the ground. He has a tremendous amount of torso rotation, but he doesn't get airborne quite as much as some other players. For example, Del Potro or Gonzalez would get airborne a lot more than Alcaraz does. And coming in at number 3 is Novak Djokovic. And I know what you're thinking if you're a fan of my channel. Nick, you made a video a year ago where you said Djokovic had the greatest forehand in the history of tennis. And I want to tell you that the context of that video was the following. I said that while Djokovic doesn't have the most penetrating forehand of all time, he doesn't have the most lethal forehand of all time, it's the one that I would pick out of all-time greats if I had to put my money on it. This was more related to Djokovic's consistency and the ability to play his best tennis in the most important moments. But in today's video, we're taking the forehand stroke in isolation. It's for that reason that I placed Djokovic's forehand at number 3 of all time. Now, what I like the most about Djokovic's forehand is his versatility. If you watch Djokovic play on clay, you will see that he has the ability to play the forehand a lot higher, very similar to Rafa. When he plays on hard court or when he's playing extremely aggressive, he can flatten the forehand out. He has incredible placement. He can hit any spot on the court that he wants to. He can create winners from defensive situations. And most importantly, in my opinion, Djokovic has the most consistent forehand in the history of tennis. So while it might not be the most penetrating and the most powerful one, it is the one that's going to break down the least compared to all other players. I attribute this to Djokovic's simplicity of his stroke. There are no unnecessary movements in his swing. He does have a loop. His racket is quite high in the take back. He has a bent arm and he has a very steep vertical swing path, and it puts a tremendous amount of spin on the ball. Now, interestingly, Djokovic is one of the only players that has more of a classic finish where he often finishes above his shoulder. He doesn't do this all the time, of course, but this is something that's uncharacteristic when we're talking about modern ATP Forehands. Coming in at number 2, it's my favorite player of all time and my favorite forehand of all time, and that's Rafael Nadal. I cannot tell you how much fun it was to watch Rafa hit his forehand cross-court topspin against Federer very early on in his career, where Federer was the absolute GOAT, and Nadal was driving Federer crazy because his forehand, in my opinion, is the heaviest one in the history of tennis. This is due to Nadal's swing path that's extremely vertical. Most of the time he goes around his head. Now other players do this as well. So you're going to see Federer, you're going to see Djokovic also go around the head, but Rafa does it with more speed and more intensity. So often players will go around their head in defensive situation, but not Rafa. Rafa does this as an offensive move and not a defensive one. And often Nadal's forehand was stigmatized because of this finish, and it was mislabeled as a defensive shot when in reality it is not. This was even done in the close circle of Nadal, where I've seen Tony Nadal trying to correct this forehand at certain times. Of course, he allowed Nadal to play his intuitive way, but I have seen some videos where Tony was trying to get Nadal to go in a more conventional way around his body. And interestingly, when you watch Nadal practice, you will see that he often goes to a more conventional finish, but then when he gets on the match court, his intuition kicks in, and 90% of the time he does his buggy whip finish. And what he's able to do is play the ball higher over the net with a tremendous amount of spin and power, and it's truly a nightmare because he's lefty, and if you're right-handed receiving the ball, it is truly an absolute nightmare. So Rafael Nadal has the second most lethal forehand in the history of tennis. And now coming in at number 1, the undisputed king of all forehands, the greatest forehand in the history of tennis, and it's Ernest Gulbis. I'm just kidding, and this is not a diss on Gulbis, very similar to Benoit Paire. It's unbelievably quirky what Gulbis used to do, but when you take a look at his forehand in the front, it's very clean and he has all the fundamentals. So Gulbis does have an incredible forehand, but the player with the greatest forehand of all time is Roger Federer. Similar to Nadal, Federer has a straight arm forehand where the racket drops on the side of his body. Now compared to Nadal, there was a lot of changes made to Nadal's swing. I call these cosmetic changes to Nadal's backswing. Sometimes the wrist would be bent, other times the racket would be a little bit higher. He was experimenting with different styles in his backswing. However, Federer kept it really clean through the entirety of his career. He would simply close the racket on the hitting side of the body and unleash the monster forehand. And now the thing about Federer that's different from Nadal is that he plays the forehand lower than Nadal. Now this doesn't mean that the forehand has less spin. It has a tremendous amount of spin, but his forehand is more penetrating and goes lower over the net and penetrates through the court in a different way. Now you're probably thinking, Nick, why did you put Federer at number 1 above Rafa if Rafa is your favorite forehand of all time? Well, I can tell you that I do a tremendous amount of research on the game of tennis, and I listened to the best players. And when they're asked who has the best forehand in the history of tennis, the number 1 answer is Roger Federer. And this is coming from the players, and they know best because they faced Roger Federer on the court. And what happens when Federer gets a ball that's in his strike zone, you can kiss the point goodbye. In perfect harmony with his serve, where he would spot serve wherever he wanted to, he was looking to start the rally with his forehand. And if that return was somewhere in the middle of the court, I don't know the stats on that, but my feeling is that Federer would win the point in the vast majority of the cases, because once you got on the defensive against Federer's forehand, there was not much you can do. But besides all that, I think sometimes having a great stroke comes down to genetics and comes down to talent. And if you remember during the pandemic when Federer was hitting balls against the wall, I can tell you that I've never seen anybody rip the ball as hard as Federer does. When I watch Federer now, after he's retired, hit a few balls for fun, the amount of power that he can generate from his arm without even using his body is incredible. And now comes the important part of this video, where I discuss how these rankings affect you at the recreational level, but not only the recreational level, how this affects tennis in general. And I can tell you that Roger Federer not only has the greatest forehand in the history of tennis, it is also the most popular forehand because of its elegance. So naturally, a lot of coaches started teaching this forehand once Federer came on the scene, and a lot of recreational players started copying Federer's forehand style. I can tell you that I received a tremendous amount of DMs and emails with players showing me their forehands, which was directly inspired from Federer. And here comes the warning. You have to differentiate between style and fundamentals. And I've said this before, and you take a look at any of the forehands that I mentioned as the greatest forehands in the history of tennis, they all have fundamental elements in common, and they all have differences in style. Unfortunately, when players copy Federer's forehand, they're not necessarily looking at the fundamentals, they're looking at style. So they most likely are going to try to mimic Federer's racket drop and his straight arm, and so on. You have to build the fundamentals of the forehand stroke that all players have in common and develop your own style, because no matter how hard you try, your forehand will unfortunately never look like Federer's.